Hello and welcome to another video in the How Do I Do Something in CloudBolt video series. My name is Mike Bombard. I'm a principal cloud architect here at CloudBolt on the pre-sales side of the house. And for this video, we're going to talk through how do we work with Terraform in CloudBolt. And this is really kind of more of a use case oriented example. I had a customer who asked me just basically, for example, we need to start provisioning Azure Blob from the CloudBolt catalog. How would we do that with Terraform? Can you walk us through that process? So part of this video, we're going to start off working in Azure, just taking a look at the Azure UI and what that looks like in the UI. Then we'll go through actually constructing the Terraform scripts, testing the Terraform scripts, and then getting them placed into CloudBolt as backing for those blueprint items. So I'm not going to dive into this a ton. This is kind of the same. I reused this. So just talking about CloudBolt winning with Terraform and Terraform winning with CloudBolt. I covered this in the first Terraform video. We'll include a link to that first video in the comment section here. Just kind of as more background around the Terraform operations. Like I mentioned, this is really just a use case where we're building something for real from start to finish to include Terraform troubleshooting, CloudBolt, and everything in between. So here's kind of what our agenda looks like. So we're going to start by setting up a Terraform environment in my local workstation. We're going to go through writing those scripts. We're going to talk about using a Terraform provider and how to authenticate and drive variables in and go through that entire process. Then we're going to test those Terraform scripts. Then we're going to take, and the one step I'm realizing I missed on my agenda, we're going to push those Terraform scripts into a GitHub repo or your favorite Git-based source control repository technology. Then we're going to create a blueprint in CloudBolt. We're going to create variable maps, create parameters. Then we're going to go over to the blueprint and build out the blueprint, add the Terraform operation. Every Terraform operation is then granted access to environments. Then we're going to test it and see that end-to-end process. So it should take about an hour. We'll get through this end-to-end, walk through the entire process, and just show you how you can very quickly get up and running with new catalog content in CloudBolt leveraging Terraform. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to walk through the process of kind of the beginning to end picture of working with Terraform and CloudBolt. So this is all the way from designing a set of Terraform scripts up to pushing it out into our GitHub repository and then building out a CloudBolt blueprint that drives variables into these Terraform configs. So I'm going to go ahead and start. I have a GitHub repo that I keep my Terraform scripts in. I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder in here. One of the things you'll notice when we get to creating the blueprint is we will point at this entire repository, but in the repository, we're going to change into specific directories depending on the blueprint that we're executing. So the first thing we're going to do is start a new folder. And this is going to be we're going to create an Azure storage container. So let's get started there. And this is kind of my first foray into Azure storage containers. The request was around Azure Blob storage. So really, I like to do these manually first. So I have this MB testing resource group. In this resource group, I have a storage account that I created. That storage account has certain settings and things that we may want to tweak on the storage account, things like authentication, other kinds of settings that you may want to either hard code or variabilize to allow the end user to talk to it. And then inside of the container, inside of the storage account, there is then a storage container. So we then have this storage container where this container is how we're going to be able to upload files. And those files, when working with Azure storage containers, are really blobs. So a text file would be a blob. You can have directories and things like that. I've done a lot more with S3 buckets, so similar to objects in an S3 bucket. One of the things I did not pick up on before until I was clicking through here is this blob service. Oh, so it just takes you to the containers. So interesting. So let's go ahead and get started. I am by no means an expert in Azure storage solutions, so you may find a far better way of doing this. This is just a basic way to get started. Again, Terraform and those kinds of things. So I'm going to, typically the way that I build these, I usually have at least 3 files, sometimes a 4th for outputs if I want to declare those a little separately. But Terraform, usually there's a main.tf file that handles most of the work for the resource provisioning. A providers file that then declares which provider we're going to use. In this case, we're going to use the AzureRM provider. And then a variables file that declares what input variables we need to capture. So we'll go through, we'll set all of those up. I'm just going to create my files real quick. Main.tf. Let's do another file. We'll call this outputs.tf. You can just kind of copy that structure. Providers, let's just and then variables.tf. And really, I think with Terraform, you can call these anything you want. I think this is just kind of a standard for what I've seen most people do. Anything in this directory will get loaded when you run a Terraform apply from within the directory. You can then have subdirectories or reference modules that are outside of this directory. We're not going to go that deep today. Usually I start with the providers. So what I've done here is I've just searched for the Azure Terraform provider. I've gone to their documentation site, where the documentation tab, I can view all of the different resources that exist out there. So maybe we just switch over to, I believe, storage. Okay, so here's storage, and then we're going to start with a storage account, and then in that account, we're going to create a container. So they give you examples, which is really helpful, helps you get up and running pretty quickly. So we're going to use those to start. But since we're working with the provider, usually with Terraform, the provider gives you documentation on how to authenticate to this provider. So let's go ahead and copy all of this. Let's paste it in here. I don't need any configuration options, so I'm just going to leave the provider blank, I believe. I'm just going to check my web app here, but I'm pretty sure. I mean, I could give it a blank features, but I don't know that there's anything needed there. Well, maybe there is. There you go. Thanks, ChatGPT. Yeah, we'll leave features blank. I don't know that we need to pass anything additional in. But when you're using the documentation from the site, it's going to give you the version for the most up-to-date or Azure provider. So that's already included in there. This is good to hard code because these provider versions change all the time, and you don't want to have something break on you if you haven't specified the provider version you're going to a different system. Okay, so providers is done. Next thing we're going to do is go into the main.tf script. I'm going to build this out all at once. So I'm just going to take their example, and then I'm going to go over to the storage container. Actually, I'm going to take the storage container example because it includes all three. So I think that's a good start. So this builds, this example builds a resource group, then builds a storage account, then builds a storage container. I'm going to I don't want to build a resource group. I want to allow the customer to select an existing resource group. This would be the idea of deploying a resource with other things that have already been provisioned. So instead of a resource type, we can change this over to a data type. And I don't believe we need the location in here. So one of the ways we can find out in the documentation, if you scroll down towards the bottom here, you can see data sources. When we look at data sources, let's see it for resource group. Let's do, there we go, AzureRM resource group. So that would be the resource type, but here's the data source. So this is how you would reference an existing object without creating that object. So notice all it needs is the name of that object to reference it. So our resource group, and I'm going to do var.resource group name. So I'm going to variabilize this. I want the system to pass in the existing resource group that CloudBolt already knows about because we're storing those on the environments. We'll give them a list of resource groups that they have visibility over, and then they'll be able to select it from the dropdown. So there we go. We're going to then jump over to our variables script, and variables is going to be, I'm going to call this, what did I need to call this? Resource group name. There we go. And it's going to be type string. And then I'm also going to include a default. I'm just going to give this a value. When I'm building these for testing, Actually, I'm going to use an existing resource group. I'm going to use that one that we were looking at here. So the resource group here is MB-testing. That way I don't have to think about it. So one of the things I always do is I test locally against Terraform. If it doesn't work from your command line on your computer, it's never going to work in CloudBolt. So I make sure that these scripts work first, and then I put it into CloudBolt. So I'll put defaults in here, and I'll use those while I'm testing and building this out. So resource group default. And if you're using a variable, actually I'm going to save all real quick, just make sure they're saved to the file. If I'm using a variable in my main.tf, it also has to be declared in my variables file. So that's, as I add new variables here, I'll go into the variables file and add them in as well. So let's do this. Then we need storage account. So we're going to do var.storage account name. There we go. Notice the resource group name. I'm going to change this a little bit. I don't like leaving an example in here. So I'm just going to say resource group name is RG. It's going to be storage account. So storage account. And then the container is going to be, I'm going to do storage container because there's lots of other kinds of containers. Okay, so we've renamed everything. So we kind of have to go through and repoint these. So you'll notice here, this was AzureRM resource group. Notice it's white now. The reason is because if it's a data source, we need to tell it that we need to reference it with data. Then it's going to AzureRM resource group, and then its example, which no longer exists. So we need to point this at .rg. So we're going to take the name of the resource group. We're also going to take the location of the resource group. So just kind of copy what I just did. Got an extra A in there. Okay, so we storage account name. Notice that is now in red. So that tells me I need to go over to my variables file and create the variable. So storage account name, I'm just going to copy all of this, place it in there. Now we have another variable for storage account name. One of the other things with storage account name is these cannot have any dashes or hyphens or anything else. It's alphanumeric characters only. So we'll put some constraints in CloudBolt to ensure that we're getting a good storage account name when we build this out. We could also write like a script for validation that goes out and checks Azure to make sure that a storage account doesn't exist with that name already, because eventually somebody's going to try and get another storage account with the same name. So okay, there we go. So there's our storage account name. I also know that I'm going to need a storage container name. So okay, my container name, and then let's just change that. It doesn't need to be an account because it's not an account. Again, just setting default so I don't have to type this in. You could also do a TFRs file if you wanted to do that, but I just like setting it as defaults, and then I don't have to think about it. Okay, so account tier. This is something that I do want to variabilize. I'm going to do var.account tier. Actually, I may rename a couple of these. I have a variable set already in CloudBolt. We'll talk through that, but that has a lot of these inputs for this kind of a thing already. So if I use the same names, I can reuse that variable set, which makes it really handy. So account tier, I think I left that as standard. I think when you go to the different accounts, I'm going to leave that alone for now. So we're going to leave that as standard. I am going to allow the replication type to be variabilized. So let's do, this is going to be var.account replication type, and we'll give them a couple of options there. Let's go over to the variables file, and then account replication type, I can just. So one of the things to note is that you can go through for each of these things that we're building. So the storage container has different attributes for the storage container itself. So it gives you some defaults or just some main things when I'm going to move this over here. I don't really need outputs up right now. So we're going to close that so I can see all of them. I don't need my Azure Web App providers either. There we go. Now we can see all of our files. So we look at the variables. Yeah, so talking through variables, or excuse me, the attributes for each of these objects. AzureRM storage container, if you go down to the argument reference in the documentation, they'll tell you what those arguments are. They'll tell you some valid options for them. We'll get to this eventually, but there's also in a lot of these different outputs that are available for each of these. I do want to start with the storage account though. So I need the attributes for the storage account. So there we go. Things like account kind, I'm just going to leave this as a default storage v2. I believe these blob storage options and those other ones are older deprecated options. I couldn't find them in the UI. I don't even know how to change a storage account from storage v2. So I think these are older and they've probably combined them all for storage v2, but I could be wrong. So account tier, like I mentioned, we're going to go with standard. I mean, we could give them the option to do standard and premium. I think when you go to premium is when some of these options become available, now that I'm thinking back through what I went through yesterday. So anyway, we are going to leave that standard, but we're going to variabilize the account replication type. We've already set that up. Set in the default is LRS, which is locally redundant storage. We are going to go over to, I'm also going to add in, I just want to check these real quick. Resource group name, storage container name, storage account name. Okay, so those are all good. The other thing I want to do to variabilize, the other thing that I want to variabilize here is going to be the tags for this resource. So you'll notice I have tags for environment here. I'm going to add a couple here, and I'm just going to copy and paste from something else I was working on. I'm going to add in a cost center, an owner, and a group tag. These are all things. Cost center would be a custom parameter that I have set in CloudBolt already. I use this for a lot of the things that I'm doing in CloudBolt, where I can set a single cost center at the group level, and anything that group then provisions now automatically inherits that cost center value. Other things that we know from CloudBolt would be things like owner and group. So we're going to use those variables as well. I'm just going to add those into my variables file real quick, where I can go through and grab cost center and owner. And then I can grab a default group here. That should be good here. So we have our variables, we have our provider set up, we have our main.tf set up. Now notice this is, again, this is showing it's kind of highlighted in white. And that's because it's referencing AzureRM storage account.example. We don't have an example storage account anymore. We have an account storage account. So when we're referencing other objects in here, that's not at all what I tried to do. There we go. There we go. Now it's kind of validating that. The other thing that I didn't do yet is I haven't included the variable here for the storage container name. So I'm going to do that real quick. Name, storage container name. Okay, so this is referencing the storage account it should be created in, and then this is the name that we should be creating for the storage container. I'm going to leave this as private. I don't want to allow my users to ever do anything that's not a private storage account or a storage container. So this prevents us from being exposed publicly, which could not be very good for us. But you could variabilize this and allow maybe certain users to be able to access public storage containers as well. That's entirely up to you. The other thing I'm going to do, so I have that done. I think we're good there. We have our tags, account application type. The next thing I'm going to do is work on my outputs. And the reason I like to use outputs in CloudBolt is the way that this is defined is we will actually parse all of the outputs that you've declared in your Terraform configs or scripts, and we will pull them into CloudBolt as parameters. So if we have something that we needed to pass back to the end user, we can do that in CloudBolt. So I've defined 4 different outputs. These are all going to show up as attributes on the resource that we're creating. One's going to be storage account name. So we're gonna write the storage account name back. One's going to be storage container name. This way we're tracking these things. So now notice this one is white because I had another one where I had named my storage container, but in this case I named it storage container because I think that makes a little more sense. So I'm going to be sure to swap that out. But basically this is referencing the resources that we are creating and pulling different parameters from them. Like I mentioned, outputs are typically towards the bottom of the documentation for a particular resource type, and they call them attributes. So there we go. My attributes reference here We can see if we needed to pull the ID out, if we wanted to pull primary location, secondary location, all of those things, names in here somewhere. But the ones that I want to pull from the storage account specifically are going to be the name. I'm going to want to pull in the primary web endpoint, as well as the primary connection string. And you'll notice here, let's look at primary connection string. There it is. So it doesn't tell you anything about this. I think if we click on it, it's going to give me, just takes me right to that. What I noticed the other day is when I was using this, it actually threw a warning about primary connection string, because this is something that we want to protect. You don't want your connection string out there because that could allow for connection to the storage bucket. So this has to be set as a sensitive value or it will not be available. So you have to tell it is a sensitive value. And what's interesting is in CloudBolt, it will then read that and create an encrypted field for the parameter where automation can actually use this value. You could write a day 2 action that allows the user to actually view the value so that we know that the owner is the only one getting to it, things like that. But you can control who's able to view this information. So we'll see this masked when we go into the portal. You won't be able to get to that value. So I'm going to go ahead and save all of these. Now that I've created my entire Terraform config, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to actually run it and make sure that things work. So one of the things, and this is on a Windows system, so in Windows, you can go to edit the system environment variables. I'm going to pull these off screen for a sec. Actually, this button here, this environment variables button, is what I'm going to be using to get to my environment variables. I'm just pulling them off screen because I have values set, and just you don't need to see the values. So we'll probably pull this over a little bit here on the right-hand side of the screen, where we can see I've set values for ARM client ID, ARM client secret, ARM subscription ID, and ARM tenant ID. These are the 4 things that when we go to look at, let's go up to use provider. Actually, I think even better if we go back to the documentation here on the left and we go to usually authentication somewhere towards the top. Let's do overview to start, maybe. There we go, authentication. So authenticating to Azure, I am using a service principal and a client secret. So if I go over to this document, it will show you the values that I need to use, and you'll see client ID, client secret, tenant ID, subscription ID. So those are the 4 things that we need: my client ID, my client secret, my subscription ID, my tenant ID. The other thing that I will note, this is how you get it. I thought somewhere in here they called out setting it as all caps with the AzureRM like prefix or the ARM prefix. Let's see. There we go. So here's where it shows configuring the service principal in Terraform. If you are in a Linux-based system, you can also run the export command where you set these as your environment variables. There's a couple of different ways to do this. I'm doing very, very basic. Just I'm using the same service principal. I'm going to use in CloudBolt. That allows me to test the permissions for this service principal as well for where I'm trying to deploy. So I have those set. Those are my environment variables. I could also, if I wanted to validate that this works, I could do $env. I think it's like a colon. There we go. And it should print out my subscription ID or any of those other things. It's not really something that you can't really do a ton with a subscription ID, but we see that it's set. So you can go through and validate all 4 of those if you want. If you set your environment variables while VS Code is open, sometimes you need to close and reopen VS Code or just launch a new terminal. It only loads these environment IDs with Windows, I think, when you launch the terminal, but I could be there's probably a command to reload those variables. I don't know. Okay, so we are here. Now notice we're in the MB Terraform configs, my root directory. For Terraform, I do need to change directory into my Azure storage container. There we go. So I am in the proper directory now. I'm in the root for this specific set of Terraform scripts. So when I do, I'm going to go through and do a Terraform init first. This will go out and pull down the required provider. So you see it's pulling in my AzureRM Terraform provider at 3.78.0. We now have the required Terraform components installed here. I can do a Terraform plan just to see what things are going to look like. Maybe that's a good next step. I could also write this plan output and save it. So notice something's wrong. I missed an example in here. So on line 8, as I was stealing from the example, I missed something here. So that's interesting. Yeah, I didn't. Yeah. So it's rg dot. Yeah, this is the resource group object that we're referencing here. And then we're just pulling the parameters from that object. So let's save that again. Let's go ahead and rerun plan. This will go through and check your syntax and make sure that your scripts are set up correctly. There we go. So it's going to add 2 objects, which is what I was expecting. Notice I have 2 resources declared in here. Again, a data type, it's going to pull an existing resource, but the resource types, it's going to do a create action. So 2 to add, node, we're not going to change or destroy anything, which is good. We don't want to be destructive. Now we can go ahead and run a Terraform apply. This is going to go out. It's going to rerun the plan step. So you could also just run the apply and look at your output before telling it to go. So again, 2 to add, 0 to change, 0 to destroy. So I'm going to type in yes and make sure that this builds the storage account that we're expecting. All right, so our apply has completed. I kind of paused for a second there just to let things run through. Our storage container should now be out there in my MB testing group. If I refresh here, we should see there is my MBCB test account 1. And inside of this account, I now have a single container here. So we can see it was a private container. There's really not a ton of other things that we've done to this yet. But very, very basic operation. We've built something with Terraform. I'm now going to go and ensure that this also tears down with a Terraform destroy. Oh, if I could spell it. Okay, it's gone through. Plan 0 to add, 0 to change, 2 to destroy. I expect that because this is a teardown operation. So I'm going to tell it yes and pause for a few seconds while it does its magic. Perfect. Destroy is complete. Everything should be cleaned up now. Sometimes the Azure UI is lagging with what the API understands to be correct. So I'm certain that this is now gone. It just takes a minute or 2 with Azure to reflect appropriately. This would have errored if it wasn't torn down. So yeah, notice not found. So there, it's already having an issue with it, but it was showing in the UI just a little bit after. There we go. Gone now. So just one of the things you'll want to recognize as you're testing these things, give Azure a minute to catch up to what the API understands, or the database already knows. So, okay, destroy is complete. That means our Terraform config, as far as I'm concerned, is good to go. The next thing that I'm going to do is I need to get that into my GitHub repository. So I have GitHub desktop that's watching this repository on my computer. There's a couple of other ways to do this. You can do it with the Git command line. There's a number of different ways to do that. This video is not covering that today, but I'm going to go ahead. I'm just using the main branch because it's a repo that only I use, but I'm going to say storage container commit it to main. I'm going to push it up to GitHub. This now exists in our GitHub repository, and I'm able to go start working inside of CloudBolt to get this stood up and ready to deploy. All right, so now I've logged into CloudBolt. I've opened the portal there. One of the first things I did, and I've recorded this entire thing and the whole video was messed up. So some of this is already done. I like to kind of work through it most of the time, but I'm just not going to redo all of that work. But the first thing that I did was set up my variable map. So in CloudBolt, with Terraform, we allow you to leverage something called variable maps that will map CloudBolt parameters to Terraform variables. So you'll notice my Terraform config, if I were to run this in CloudBolt without passing anything but authentication to it, it will actually work, but it's going to use all of these defaults. So if I run it more than once, it's just going to keep trying to create the same thing, which could be bad and destructive. So we want to ensure that we are driving these variables into this config at the time of provisioning. So anything that you want the end user to have control over in the cloud provider itself should be declared as a variable. And then you can control those a little more tightly in CloudBolt once they've been exposed. So I have some variable maps here. So I'm going to start with the variable maps. You don't have to. You could also build the blueprint, then build the variable maps and come back. Just when I build this blueprint, you'll see that these variable maps, if they're there, it makes it a little easier if you do this first. One of the things I'll point out to start is there are some system when you leverage the CloudBolt Terraform operations, there are two of these variable maps that come out of the box. One is your AWS to Terraform variable map, as well as your Azure to Terraform variable map. So I am going to use my Azure to Terraform variable map, and you'll notice what this is it's a mapping of keys and values to what we're going to pass into the Terraform execution. And these are the exact same parameters that I used in my environment variables when we were deploying locally. So ARM client ID, tenant ID, client secret, subscription ID. These are all things that CloudBolt stores at the resource handler level, because this is how we're authenticating with the system. So that's why I chose that authentication mechanism. What this will do, these double curly brackets, this is Django templating. What we'll do in the blueprint is we're going to add a couple of environments to this Terraform config, allow the user to select from environments that they've been granted access to. And then what we can do is from the environment that was selected, we can pull information from those environments. And you'll see that there's a couple of other things on here that we'll pull as well that are already set on the environment. Things like the resource group name are set at the environment level today. So we have our authentication is going to be handled with this Azure to Terraform variable map. The second thing that I did is I went through and created, for AWS, you'll see I have this AWS tags one. So group and owner were two of the things that I have done for a couple of the AWS examples that I'm doing. For Azure, I actually added in a third, and that was that cost center, where if we scroll down to, there we go, Azure tags, you'll notice that we're passing in the group, we're passing in the owner, we're passing in the cost center. Now, one of the things you could do is if you're doing the same tags across everything, you have a tagging standard, whether it's AWS, Azure, vCenter, doesn't really matter where it goes. You could define one tag variable map, and then we're always going to capture those tags as long as your Terraform config includes those as variables. When you are setting your variable maps, if this is something we're trying to pass to the Terraform variables, it needs to be prepended with TF_var all caps. Reason for that is we are executing the Terraform command line. So this will pass this into the command line, and these have to be prefixed with TF_var for it to pass them into the variables here. So I've made the mistake 3 or 4 times. I keep going back to the devs. It's not working. It's because I keep forgetting TF_var. So make sure that those are in there. So this is going to be two of the things are things that we already know about the request, the group and the owner, based off of who's submitting it. So we know the group because there is a group that's being passed in the context when we render these templates. We also know the owner name because we can get to from what we call a blueprint item argument, which is the inputs that we're passing for the Terraform operation tier. That has a blueprint order item that's tied to it that actually gets you back to the order that's being submitted itself. And every order has an owner. That owner has a full name. So you can navigate that in Shell Plus is how I figured this out. But you can probably just take what I did here and reuse this. And then we have the Azure, the cost center. Notice that this is not referencing anything else. So what this does is it will find a parameter that exists that's called cost center, and it will pull in the environmental logic that we may have set around this. So if this cost center exists on the environment that we're executing against, it will pull in any constraints that we've set at that environment. If it doesn't exist on the environment, it will pull in your global values that you've defined for this parameter. We'll see what that looks like in just a minute. And then finally, so I'm going to use 3 different variable maps. Again, I like to split these up because authentication is one piece, and I can reuse this for literally all of my Azure Terraform configs. Azure tags is something else that I may also use across my Azure Terraform configs as well. So something that if we're going to reuse it and we can make these a little more modular in function, I'm going to do that. And then I also do usually a third variable map, and you can have as many variable maps as you want, but a third one that relates to the Terraform script itself. So these are things that are only going to be on this independent Terraform script. So things like our resource group name, our storage container name, our account replication type, and the storage account name. Variable storage, hold on, that's not right. Variable storage account name. Yeah, it should just be storage account name. So let's fix that. Let's go into this is what a variable map looks like. To edit it, it's just a dictionary that we're working with. but we do not want this. What's interesting is, oh, you know what? I bet it did last time. It worked, but I bet it took the default. So just double check this against your variables. Make sure that they are the same. I'm going to go ahead and save this now. So now I have 3 variable maps that I'm going to use in a new blueprint that I'm going to create. So we're going to create this blueprint from scratch. We're not going to reuse that. Actually, I take this back. The next thing that I did after creating the variable maps, some of these parameters didn't exist, like resource group name, storage account name, storage container name. So you then have to create any parameters and tell the system about these inputs. Like, what type are they? Are we going to create drop downs for this, or is it an open string? And if it's a string, are there constraints on it? I will also, when I create new parameters, I like to prepend them with something that helps to namespace them and make them unique. So you'll notice that the storage account replication type, the storage account name, the storage container name, these were all namespaced parameters. I think if we go back to, let's look at our variable maps again. Let's just... So you'll notice these 3 were all Azure _ storage was the prefix. So they're namespaced for a specific use case. That way, if I'm trying to find the parameters, I can just look for Azure storage and find it real quick. The other thing I didn't point out is the resource group name, because we already pull in resource groups at the environment level to allow the user to select from a dropdown. I'm just referencing the resource group that's set on the environment. So it's pulling it in from the environment, and you'll see the list of dropdowns as we go to submit a request. The other ones, AWS account, oh, sorry, wrong thing. Azure tags. Again, these are the cost center tag. It does exist, but it's not namespace because I'm using this more globally. It's not constrained to a specific use case. And then the Azure to Terraform, these are just kind of things that we have out of the box. So really the only things that I needed to create were these 3 parameters. Okay, so these Azure storage parameters, I have one for replication type. And if we go into replication type, what you'll notice is I have it set as required. I want the replication type to be, they have to input this replication type. I might make this, I'm not sure yet. Replication type, I didn't have that set as an output, but I'm actually going to set this as an attribute. What that will do is it's going to show that my replication type for this storage container is LRS or GRS. I didn't give them access to, so you'll notice this, the Terraform provider still comes in play when we're building out these the variable sets and everything we're doing with parameters, because we need to understand what these inputs are. A lot of times I'll come back here and look at, what am I doing for my storage? Was that for the account? Bear with me for just a second. Yeah, so that's for the Azure storage account. So there's our storage account. So they have GRS. My default's LRS. You'll notice if we scroll down, there's a couple of types. LRS, GRS, you could give some of these other types as well. I took a little bit of a different approach here. I actually, versus, we could go through and define global options here where we type in, well, you notice the dropdown's already here because I have a generated options plugin defined, but I could type in LRS and type in GRS and type in the other types. But what happens if the end user doesn't know what each of those types is? So what I did was created a generated options plugin here, where this plugin is a real basic Python script where I defined 2 options. The options is a list of tuples. So these are ordered lists, and the first item in the tuple is going to be the value we're going to capture. So LRS and GRS will be passed to the Terraform script because that's what the script's looking for. But we're going to give the end user a more meaningful label. So this is just the user-friendly value. They're going to see locally redundant or globally redundant when they select this. So this is just one of the things we'll do where we show the user a label, but we're going to capture something completely different for a value because that's what automation's expecting. So I have this generated options plugin defined for this parameter. So that's all set up here. It's giving the users a list of acceptable values so they don't have to go out and figure out what acceptable values are. The other two were the storage account name and the storage container name. And I think I've put a couple of constraints around these. I selected the wrong thing. These both, I think, are set the same way. So we're just going to look at one of them. So storage account name, I'm setting as required. I'm not going to make this shown as an attribute because my outputs from my Terraform config are actually going to write what Terraform sees as the name. And I think that that's probably better from a source of truth perspective. But what I will point out here is I put some constraints around this because it's just an open string. I don't want the user to run into failures when building this. So some of the things I ran into when building from Terraform was hyphens and underscores are not accepted as input. So I built a regex expression that just says anything that's lower or uppercase numeric or numerical will accept between 5 and 50 characters. So I've put some constraints on these two fields as far as when they're naming things. Again, one of the other things you could do here when we're building the blueprint is you could write a validation plugin that goes through and checks the storage account name as well as the storage container name against Azure to validate that in the account selected that there are no storage accounts or containers, depending on what the requirements in Azure are for naming for those things, to validate that nothing exists with the same name today. And if it does, we're going to stop it before they build. So just something else that I would probably consider for a production use case. Okay, so we have our variables, or excuse me, our variable maps are now set up. We looked at the parameters that were created. So if we've declared something in a variable map that isn't already on the environment or something that CloudBolt knows about, we need to create those parameters in the system first. Once we've done that, though, we're kind of done from an inputs perspective. So now this gets really easy in that we can go over and I can create a new blueprint. Actually, you know what? I said I was going to go and create this from scratch, but I'm just going to cover the existing one because it's just really straightforward. And you know what? I did, I lied. I'm gonna delete the original one and then create a new one because, yeah, give me just a second. I'm gonna delete that and we'll be back. All right, so we're gonna go and we're gonna start by creating a new blueprint. We're gonna give it a name. So Azure Storage Container. And I'm gonna just denote this as Terraform v3. That helps me tell just for demo purposes, I can tell that this is Terraform on the back end that's handling these things. Creates container for file storage and Azure storage. Let's start here. All right, so here's our description. I like to, just for Terraform, again, for demo purposes, I usually put this in here as a logo. For production, I'm probably going to find that Azure Storage Account logo and put it in here so it kind of looks and feels just like they're working with Azure. So here's my Terraform image. Resource name template. I'm not going to do anything with that today, but you can template the name of the overarching blueprint. Not going to do that today. The blueprint I usually set to Terraform deployment, just that way I know that this is a blueprint that contains a Terraform deployment. We could also create another resource type for this. It's kind of up to you. Let's go ahead and save, and then we have my new blueprint. From here, kind of work through the caution flags here. You can determine who is able to deploy this blueprint. I'm going to say that everybody can because I'm the only person that ever uses this environment. So in my use case, it doesn't really matter. Then I can go over to the build tab and I can add in, that's not what I wanted. I can add in a Terraform operation. And this Terraform operation, then I can go out and define, while we're waiting for that to load, I'm going to log into GitHub. Get to the right URL and all of that fun. Okay, so I need, nope. There we go. Okay, so Terraform configs. I'm going to need the link, or actually the URL for my repo. I'm going to just paste that real quick so that I don't forget I have it. But fetch a git repo from a URL, and we'll talk about that when we get back down there. Anyway, This Terraform operation is the blueprint item we're going to add. We can share this among other blueprints if we wanted to start combining these together. But let's say this is an Azure storage container. This actually might complain about that. Actually, I don't need to tell it it's with Terraform because it's Terraform operation. But anyway, okay, this Terraform operation, we can specify the version of Terraform that we want to use. This allows us to be very, to tightly control which version we're going to use for every specific blueprint item in the catalog. Confirm Terraform plan. I am going to select this. This allows me to look at the plan and say, is this what I was expecting? So just like we did with Terraform, it's going to tell me how many to create and destroy so that I can get some visibility over it. If the users that are consuming this service don't understand Terraform and your Terraform is developed correctly, you can deselect this because they're never going to understand what that Terraform plan looks like or what they should do with it. Resource type, I'm going to set this as, this is representing the Azure storage account itself. So I'm going to say that this is storage. This allows me to just basically say that the Terraform state file and the objects that it represents is of the type of storage. Subdirectory, this is going to be inside of my repository. Which directory are we referencing? And in this case, it's going to be Azure storage container. And we need a trailing slash here. So no beginning slash, but there is a trailing slash if it's a directory. It should be a directory. If it's not a directory, then I don't know what you're doing. So, and then here we need the Azure one. So I can just type in Azure and that's going to filter my selections. And the only three that I need there are going to be, there we go. So my tags, my storage account map, and then my variable map for Azure to Terraform. That's my authentication. One of the newer features that you'll see in this next release of CloudBolt is the ability to tag rates to individual build items in CloudBolt, even if it's not for things that aren't servers. So I'm going to just say it's $15 a month for now. You can also write a rate hook for this as well. So something else that's coming that I hope to get out there in a video here soon. I'm going to target my main branch in my Git repo. So I added my file location, which is just the link directly to the Git repo itself. So you can just go to the code. If it's GitHub, go to code, copy that, include it in here. We also do support most of the other. I haven't run into any of these Git repositories, Bitbucket, GitLab, Azure DevOps that we don't support yet. So refresh on order, I'm going to say yes. And what that does is every time I reorder this item, it's going to go back out to Azure or to GitHub and ensure that I have the latest version of my code for my Azure storage account. So it's going to automatically pull that in. And then the last thing is a connection info. And this is something you will have set up in advance. A connection info is authentication information for connecting to these clouds. I'm going to go to my GitHub connection info, and I'm going to go ahead and save. And hopefully I selected the right connection info. 9 times out of 10, I don't. So good. I did it right the first time this time. Now we have this Azure storage container build item on our blueprint. This automatically for Terraform, you don't have to worry about a teardown action because it's Terraform. If there's a Terraform element on the build tab, we will automatically run Terraform destroy for them when we tear this down. You can see my 4 files that I'd created. So my main outputs, providers, and variables, those all exist inside of CloudBolt now. We've pulled down the repository. We understand the files that we care about in that directory. I can also go out and now attach an environment. And I just, maybe I can add 2, but I'm going to say I need an Azure environment. So I'm going to start with my East US. Let's start with that one, and I'll add in Southeast as well and see if we get anything different. I could override the environment options here. You'll notice that for resource group, there is a default for the SE demo resource group. That's the only option available. So it won't even let me pre-select it or predetermine it here. So I'm just going to leave that as is. I'm going to try the Southeast one and see if that's a little different. But we can override options at the environment level here on the Terraform operation as well. So I'm going to attach one more. Do Southeast US. I really have no idea what's going on in that environment. So this could be an adventure. Let's try one more time. Maybe I missed. South Central US. There we go. South Central is mapping in. And there's a lot more that's in here. Let's see. So you'll see there's a couple of resource groups that are available in this that are different than my other one. So I'm going to leave this. I'm not going to predefine it, but I'm going to go ahead and map that. This environment just has a lot more going on. It's not as clean as the other one. But since we're not using most of those variables, it doesn't matter. We're never going to reference them, or we aren't in this specific use case. Now that we have our blueprint, we have our build item, and we've mapped environments, we should be able to go out and deploy. So let's go ahead, go to overview and order. Usually the first thing I'm testing here is form effectiveness. But if I go to my IT group has access to both environments, so they can select the one they want to deploy to. Storage account name should have my regex validation on there. So if I put something in with a space or an underscore, it's going to kick that back and say this doesn't work. Locally redundant, globally redundant. So the drop down's there. I do not see my resource group name in East US. And the reason is there's only a single option for resource group in East US. But if I change to South Central US, it should open up the field to allow me to select one of those. I may have to check into that. You'll see when we provision this, it will build it in that SE demo group. I'm kind of curious about this one though. I'll have to play with that offline, but it's going to take the resource group for this specific environment. It's going to pass that over. So I'm going to give it a storage account name, CBB account 2. Container 2. I'm going to do locally redundant storage. I'm going to go ahead and press submit. Oh, so there we go. So my regex worked. Hey, good for me. So the dash hyphens are not allowed, and I'm the biggest. I put hyphens in everything. So every time I go to Azure, there's a lot of services that just don't like hyphens. Anyway, let's try this again. There we go. So now what's happening is this is my blueprint order. So I'm going to make this full screen. So we're tracking my blueprint as it deploys. Now it's running my Terraform job, and this should pause in a second because we had that approval step. It's doing the Terraform init. So it's pulling down our Terraform provider into a working directory in CloudBolt. So it's pulling that down. So notice it's now paused. I could press play here, but I'm going to go into the job itself. That's going to give me a lot of usable information about this Terraform operation. I can look at all of my Terraform output here if I'd like. But really, this is typically what I'm going to look at is here is I'm going to add two things. Again, that's storage account, storage container. I'm not going to change or destroy anything. So this to me is a safe operation. Then we can look at the changes to output. So again, we're going to have outputs. These will be attributes in CloudBolt. The connection string, notice that is a sensitive value. So like I mentioned, we set that as sensitive. And then web endpoint, we don't know that yet. So it's going to tell us after it creates this. But I'm going to go ahead and continue the job. This is going to go out and start the Terraform build process. So this should refresh here in just a second. I believe it's out there building now. So it's going on to the apply step. If we go over to the log, we get a little more information. So we resumed the job and now it's doing the apply. And I'm just going to pause while that happens. We'll come back in once it completes. Okay, so Terraform apply is complete. Took about 2 minutes to go through the entire process. So now at this point, we've started from scratch with Terraform with a provider that I'd done very little with. Granted, I did some work on this yesterday, but in less than an hour from start to finish yesterday, starting from scratch, it took me about an hour and 15 minutes. So learning a brand new provider, new resource type that I had no idea about. Now there's probably a lot more in depth we can go to, but this gets us a good start where we're up and building things quickly with Terraform because it allows me to declare things as code versus having to understand every single individual API. It abstracts a lot of that complexity. Now we have a new resource that's been built here. I can go over to my resource, and this is this resource. This is the state resource. So this represents the state for the thing that we built with Terraform. So when this loads, it can take a second just because we're parsing the state file to ensure that we have up-to-date information, especially if this is like stored with remote state. It's somewhere that's off away somewhere in Terraform Cloud. S3 bucket. But we can see now on my storage container, the things that we declared as outputs, our storage account name, our storage container name. We can see our web endpoint. So if this is something that we needed to get to, I don't think I can get to because I shouldn't be able to get to it because this was private. No, so maybe it's just because there isn't any content, but it was set to private, so we shouldn't be able to get there anyway. So the connection string, again, I can use this for automation. It is stored here. Maybe we mask this from the end user. We could set that attribute value to not visible, and then the user wouldn't be able to see it, but we still have the metadata tied to the object. So we have this information here. I could go through delete, and this will do the Terraform destroy. If I go over to jobs, we can kind of look at things historically, and then we can go to the output, which actually shows the Terraform state itself. Notice some of these things are going to be marked as sensitive so that you don't see them in the state file. But you can get to the state file, and if your end user knows what they're doing with this, they can view it. I think we can also hide this based off of roles in the system as well. So maybe you want to mask that from the end user, and all they see are the attributes that we've declared that they should have access to. But now I have a new resource that exists out there in my service catalog. The last thing I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead and tear this down with a destroy. So it's going to go ahead and run the Terraform destroy operation now. And it should also show the output here. I don't know if this pauses on destroy when it deletes. We will find out in just a second. Okay, there we go. Going through the destroy operation, using the appropriate workspace. It is deleting the resource. We'll see the Terraform delete, I think, as a separate job here in just a minute. Actually, I'm wrong because we see the init here. So it's going through doing it all from the same job. I'm going to pause for a second while this completes. And there we go. Completed 50 seconds. Resource has been reclaimed. Our accounts have been cleaned up. If I needed to see the output from the destroy, it does show here. It's not quite as clean as the other step, but you have it all here. You can get to it if needed. That way we've audited these things. They now exist inside of a system. We can see who did it, when it happened, all of those types of things. So that's kind of beginning to end. I think that's just about everything that we're going to show here. So pulling those outputs in, creating them. Yeah, hopefully this has been helpful. This concludes another video in the How Do I Do Something in CloudBolt video series. If you've made it this far, congratulations. Some of these can get to be a little bit lengthy. If you have any questions at all regarding anything that we've covered today, or really just anything about CloudBolt in general, please reach out to your account team. We're happy to cover any questions you may have. And we're always looking for additional ideas to cover as part of this series. So please reach out to your account team. Let us know how we can help you. And happy automating with CloudBolt.